Hi there, everyone. Welcome and thank you very much for joining us. This webinar, of course, will be exploring the automatic assessment four-part writing in the soon-to-be released Musition 7. As you all know, four-part writing can be a challenging and somewhat terrifying experience for many a student. Not only are they grappling with trying to negotiate basic chord spelling skills, but they're also then obviously trying to integrate those with voice leading and its many options and exceptions. So for the instructor, obviously there are also many things that make teaching four-part writing difficult. One of the main ones being that it can be quite labour intensive. So having to grade lots and lots of four-part writing exercises. So it's our hope that this new feature will be really useful in saving teachers and instructors lots and lots of time, and also giving students some really clear, concise, instant feedback to help guide their learning. Let me just bring my screen share here. Okay. So let me introduce myself. My name is Tim Wilson, and I'm largely involved with curriculum and content development here at Auralia and Musition. But I'm also joined today by two of my colleagues, Peter Lee and Tim Solly, who will be manning the Q&A. I'm just going to run a quick little poll. And this will just help to guide the webinar somewhat, just so I have a clearer idea of what all the attendees are actually interested in learning about, and it will just help focus some of the content that I deliver today. Secondly, yes, if you have any questions as we are working through the webinar, please post them in the Q&A rather than the chat. The chat will probably not be monitored so closely. And finally, if you are interested, we will be recording the webinar and emailing out a link at the end. So that will hopefully be of use to some of you and maybe to pass on to colleagues as well. All right, I'll leave the poll open just for a moment longer. So just to give you a bit of an overview of what we'll be looking at today. So, of course, one of the main things will be in exploring how the automatic grading and feedback works within this new feature, as well as exploring the various modes of use you can use, whether it's a learning or a more formal assessment or testing type environment. We'll also be exploring a whole bunch of the content that we have created and included. And also then looking at some of the options for you to grab some of that content, use it, restructure it, use it in your own courses, in your own worksheets and assessments. And then also looking at some of the customization options that are available to you. So as part of this project, we chatted with a variety of music educators from all over the globe to find out how they like to teach four-part writing. And as part of that, we explored a whole range of different options, including having a bunch of instructors actually grade a particular question that had been submitted by a student. And if anything, that process confirmed to us, which is not news to any of us, I'm sure, that if you ask 20 music instructors how they like to structure, deliver, and assess a particular task or learning area, you will probably get 20 different answers. So, which is kind of the beauty of this this creative music pedagogy world we live in. So what that means for us is we have to approach this feature in a really similar way to what we approach many of the features in Auralia and Musition, and that is providing lots of core content that you can use without needing to do any further work. But if you have really specific pedagogical needs, need really fine-grained control, various aspects of a particular task or learning area, then you can, of course, get into that and manage all of that. All right, I'll just close off the poll now. Thanks for your feedback there. Okay, excuse me. So before we jump into the content, let's jump over to actually have a look at what this looks like. So I'm currently just in Chrome, so this is all in the browser. And here's an example of, I guess, a fairly typical question, obviously blank at this stage. So this is just within a little worksheet where I've enabled some checking, which basically puts the worksheet into our kind of learning mode, where the student can submit their answer, receive feedback before they actually have to formally submit it as part of their task. Okay, so so that's essentially a blank question. I'll jump into another question now, which I completed earlier just to illustrate a few items in the feedback here. And then we'll look at some different kinds of applications for how you can structure some of these different questions. Okay, so here's one I completed earlier. And now as a student, I'm simply just going to check my answer. Okay, so there are a few things to note here. First of all, obviously, I get some nice annotation on the notation itself. I can click on the notation to also play back my answer if I like, to orally reinforce what's going on. Now, over on the right here, I also have a list of the various errors. And I can select any of these ones to then solo the error on the notation. So if I come down to my unresolved 7th here, this can be really useful for soloing this particular error, excuse me, and removing any other distractions that might be on the notation. So it just means students can really easily isolate a particular error, figure out what's going on, and then hopefully resolve the issue. I can also multi-select here as well. So if I also wanted to select this error, then I can turn on my parallel octaves. As you can see, these are all organized by bar, and depending on how we set up the particular worksheet, we do get some feedback about exactly where the error is occurring in the bar, the voices it's occurring in, and in some cases, some other text feedback, just helping to explain or define the rule a little deeper. And of course, our score up the top here, which we'll talk a little bit more about the scoring and marking schemes a little bit later. Okay, so I'm just going to jump into my next sample question here. And rather than completing an entire question here, we're just going to play around with the last two chords just so I can illustrate some of the different errors that Musition will pick up on here and report on. Now, okay, so we're going to start with a few little leading tone errors here. So then I can select voice 2 to enter the alto and the bass. And let's just go to this. Okay, so I've got a few issues here. Let's just see what Musition reports back to us initially. Okay, so straight away we can see we have incorrectly doubled the leading tone here, which has then, of course, resulted in our parallel octaves. I will point out that, again, in our discussions with various educators, we've tried to create an interface that uses various forms of modality to express, or hopefully make it really clear to students, help them differentiate between different error types, and so that they can isolate them on the notation and then work to resolving that error. So again, I can solo particular errors and so on. Now, next, I'm going to jump back in here as a student. I'm going to edit my answer. You can see here that currently under check my answer here, there's a little indicator saying 19. So in this particular worksheet, I've set it up so that I have 19 options as a student to check my answer before submitting it. It's possibly a little generous, but it is there more as a learning task as opposed to a formal assessment task in this context. Okay, so now what we're going to do, we're going to explore just a few other options here to see the other errors that appear. So I might opt in this case to just bring that the tonic back down to the 5th there. Okay, so now we can see it's picked up a few additional errors here. So not only do I have my unresolved leading tone here, I have my doubling issue still with my double leading tone. And I've now also managed to cleverly create some hidden fifths between the soprano and the bass. Okay, so next we might play around with the soprano part a little further. So we're going to remove this double leading tone and we will move that down there in the soprano on this occasion. And check my answer again. Okay, so I've managed to resolve the leading tone issue here, but now I've managed to create some contrary octaves between the previous chord and my second last chord here. So Musician's really good at picking up all these minor variants in the rules. All right, let's try a couple more variations on this. Let me see, let's try. And this time, let's do some fun things with our chordal 7th. Okay, so here you can see this time Musician has picked up, we have an unresolved 7th, which then has led to having some unequal fifths. And obviously I've neglected to include the chordal 3rd in the last chord there as well. So that's just a kind of brief overview of just some of the rule types and errors that Musician will pick up. We will explore some more of the rules a little bit later as we get into some more of the customization. But as a bit of a broad overview, I hope that kind of clarifies just the basic kind of workflow for students, how they can work through resolving some of their voice leading and chord spelling issues. Now, before I move on, I'd just like to show you just a different question type here. So the question creation engine also allows you to generate lots of different variations using the same kind of notation content and chord vocabulary. So in the previous questions that I've demonstrated, I've either had complete chords supplied up until the very last 2 chords, or I've had no chords, no actual pitch notation included at all. But in this particular question type, I've actually been given the soprano and bass parts, and as the student, I am then asked to complete the inner voices. So the question creation feature gives you lots and lots of flexibility in the way that you can create this really kind of tiered, scaffolded content to introduce key concepts in really small stages. Similarly here, if we wanted to create a question where we perhaps just provided the soprano part and the student had to complete the other 3 parts, the other 3 voices, then we can also do that. And similarly, if we wanted to provide every second chord in its complete voicing as a reference point for the student, we can also do that. So students would, in that case, just be having to complete every second chord. So essentially, most of the voice leading would be fairly clearly spelled out for them, but they would still need to make some decisions. So the key takeaway here being that lots of flexibility in the way that you can create these questions, deliver them, depending on exactly where your students are at and the type of content they need for their stage of development. Okay, let me just jump into some of the provided content here now. So we've created over 70 kind of levels, again, that you can use or that you can reshuffle to meet more specific curriculum workflows or pedagogical requirements you may have. And they go from really basic preliminary exercises through to isolated resolutions, and then slowly introducing, building upon that chord vocabulary, all the way through to chromatic harmony with applied chords, near-applied chords, mixture chords, and of course augmented sixth. So the content is, again, really finely scaffolded so that students can focus on really isolated kind of skills before they then move on to the next kind of area of learning. So it provides lots of a really graduated kind of way for students to approach this content. Let me jump back in here again and I'll give you some examples of that. So I'm just going to be working now in the general kind of practice area in Musition, looking at a few of the syllabi. So we do include a theory in Aural 1 through 4 curriculum structure that's largely mapped around a university or college 15-week semester, which can be used. But we also have included a bunch of this new four-part writing content in some of our other syllabi, including our AP Music Theory syllabus. And once you're in here, you will note that all the levels and the level structure is mapped directly to the CED. So all the level naming and structures introduce all these key concepts really closely aligned to the curriculum specification. So as you can see, as we scroll down here, by the end, we are getting into our applied chords and so on. So for now, I'm just going to work in the theory and Aural 1 syllabus just to show you how that's structured. And I'll jump over into our 4-part writing topic here. One other point that may be of interest is if you're not currently using the programs and using these syllabi, when you do use some of these provided structures, all the content is aligned across most of the topics and also across Auralia, which is Musition's kind of e-training companion. So when students are doing, say, harmonic dictation in Auralia, they can see aligned content in the 4-part writing topic in Musition. So it just aligns all that content and hopefully makes delivery of your courses a lot more seamless and integrated. Okay, so as I mentioned, a bunch of preliminary exercises here, starting from very stepwise versus skips and leaps. I'm just going to pick and choose a few levels as we go to explore some of these things. So we might jump into melodic motion initially. And many of these drills will combine notation-based questions also with text multiple choice-based questions as well, where students have to define each of these motion types. And the student can then submit their answer and then, of course, play that back. Again, to orally reinforce what's going on there. Okay, so lots of questions across each level as well for students to explore. I'll just try a few of these other questions just so you can see the kind of the content there. So again, dealing with range, and again, we might get question types that are like this, or we might get question types. Let's see if I can get something else to come up that might be a bit more interesting. Okay, and then these other types of question types, where the student in this case is having to identify the incorrect spacing between two adjacent voices. Okay, now stepping through the levels, again, introducing things like voice crossing and overlap. In this case, split across 4 staves. And in this case, the student has to identify which 2 voices cross in the displayed extract. Next is dealing with doubling and omission. I won't jump in there for now, but I do want to show you this level where the student is having to look at a 4-part excerpt and have to essentially simplify the intervals that are occurring between particular voices. So in this case, it's between the soprano and the alto. So the student has to go through and identify what's going on there. And I'm just going to click in 6 for all of them. Obviously not my finest work. And then we can clearly see the correct answer versus our answer. And again, play that back to orally reinforce the key components there. Okay, from there, moving on to understanding perfect consonances. And of course, all the content at this point is using very basic harmonic vocabulary. So even though we're introducing voice leading and spelling concepts that can be applied to a higher level of harmonic vocabulary, at this stage, we're just using chords 5 and 1 to explain these key concepts. So dealing with perfect consonances within an excerpt here. And before we jump into some of the actual 4-part writing exercises, just finally, again, being able to isolate key skills so students are able to understand the leading tone, its function, and so on. So here, for example, we'll write the leading tone in the given minor key. Into that, and then hopefully we'll get some other more interesting questions thrown into the mix here. Okay, so then we get some other question types here where the student purely has to be able to identify and resolve just the leading tone without worrying about any other kinds of voice leading or spelling rules. So in this case, and so on. Okay, so that was essentially an overview of the kind of preliminary exercises. And now I'll just show you quickly some of the isolated 5-1 resolution questions, just to show you how they work. So initially we start off with 5-1, but where the first chord is actually given. So the student only has to actually spell out the second chord here. So again, I can just choose from my voices and I'll just click in this one. Goodies. And let's see what happens here. All right, so we've got some nice parallel fifths going on here. All right, so again, as a student, I can edit my answer, play it back, and if I did have multiple errors going on there, I could then obviously solo them to isolate them. Okay, so then as we move up through the levels, we are then having to write both the 5 and the 1 chord here. And then we slowly start to introduce inversions, dealing with chordal sevenths and explaining unequal fifths. So in this case, which voice leading error is observed in the displayed extract. So the student is meant to be on the lookout for all of these kinds of errors at this stage. Introducing augmented and diminished leaps and where they occur diatonically in major and minor keys, a bunch of exercises around that, and then slowly moving into seventh chords. I won't go into all of these drills here, but as we move through the levels, some of the progressions start to get a little bit longer as the vocabulary expands into some kind of more functional and typical harmonic progressions. Okay, and dealing with 5/7 chords in all their inversions. Again, you can choose to use these, or you can choose to jump straight to one of these later levels that includes 5/7 in all its inversions going directly to 1 to combine them all together. But again, it may be useful for your students to be able to isolate and understand how to resolve a 5/4/2 chord. Okay, and as we get to the end of this particular syllabus, we're talking about approaching 5/7, understanding preparation of the seventh, and then introducing predominant chords 4 and 2 in isolation and in major and minor keys there. So you may end up with some progressions that look like this. Okay, so I'll just jump across now to our oral and theory 2 syllabus, which is where we decided to split some parts of the harmonic vocabulary in this particular case. Whoops, I don't want harmonization. I want 4-part writing. So in here, we start to introduce the next level of concepts from isolated cadential 6/4 progressions, 6/4 progressions, passing pedal and arpeggiated, and then slowly introducing more vocabulary from the 6th chord, writing deceptive cadences, writing playable cadences, Phrygian cadences in isolation, before we slowly start to introduce the 3 chord, and that will be a flat. It's just a funny font thing going on at the moment. And then slowly introducing the leading tone chord, again in isolation, and with the first chord given, so students get really good at resolving these chords without lots of other harmonic vocabulary, potentially causing them distraction or grief. And then as we move through the content, dealing with sequences, cross relations, before we get into secondary dominance and secondary leading tone chords, again in isolation and then in context. So by the time we get down the bottom here, we should end up with some slightly longer progressions that still focus on that core content, but are not so long that they're kind of overwhelming for the student. Just wait a moment for that to come up. Okay, so here you can see we have a question that's using an applied chord in conjunction with some other diatonic kind of vocabulary. And finally, in the theory and oral 3 syllabus, we dive into more chromatic content, so augmented 6 chords. Amongst other things, Neapolitan 6, and also mixture chords there in that first level there. So lots of useful content there. As I mentioned, it's really carefully scaffolded so that your students can work in really small steps as they develop their skills and their understanding of the rules. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of the depth of content that is there available for you to use. As I mentioned, some of the content may not map directly to the order of content that you like to deliver in your curriculum. So we'll have a look in a moment at how you can kind of copy, edit, reorder that content. We'll also have a look at adding your own progressions and creating your own kind of custom worksheets and levels that use that content. And then also looking at how you can save your own rule sets and customize the scoring and rule schemes. In addition to, if you choose to, you can also integrate your service with your LMS, Canvas, Blackboard, Moodle, etc., which means essentially any results from any worksheets you create in Auralia or Musition can, of course, flow directly back to your LMS gradebook, which hopefully just makes that whole process more seamless, less time spending worrying about grading, transferring results and marks and things like that. I will point out, as I said earlier, we provide lots and lots of content in there ready for you to use. You may not feel that you need to go any further with the customization, but the options are certainly there if you do want to explore that. So what I'll do is to illustrate some of these options, I'm going to jump into the Musition app. So for instructors currently, as far as administering custom tasks and creating custom questions and content, that is all done in the Mac or Windows desktop apps. You have lots and lots of functionality and control here on the types of content that you can deliver. So the first thing that I just wanted to illustrate was just on the syllabus area, which, as I mentioned, a syllabus is essentially a series of mapped levels that fit within a particular curriculum framework. So in this area, we provide lots of content that you can use. You can also really easily come down to the theory and oral syllabus here and create a copy. And then you can either reorder content, or remove content, add content to suit your particular needs. So we've got our copy here. We can name this to be whatever we want. We'll go with my family favorite of Muse 101. So we've got our copied syllabus, and we can go down to the 4-part writing topic, and we can say, that's great. I love what Aural Musition have done with this, but my students really don't need this level at all. I'm just going to delete it. And as you move down the syllabus, you might decide that you actually like to deal with, say, you like to deal with augmented and diminished leaps before you deal with some of these other key concepts. So you can simply move that level up in the list and rename it if you like as well. So lots of options there for, again, essentially reordering, reshuffling existing content without feeling as though you have to, design something from scratch. You can, of course, do that if you want, but sometimes working like this can be a much quicker and easier way to get your custom syllabus to where you want it to be. So you can do that across any of the existing syllabi, mix and match content, copy levels from one of your syllabi to another if you like. If you were perhaps creating your own syllabus and you thought this level was really useful, you could use this little feature up here in the drop-down menu and say copy the syllabus, and then you could copy that to your own separate custom syllabus. So really flexible, again, in the way you can use existing content to easily map things to your specific curriculum requirements. Okay, now that we've looked at that, we might look at creating our own progression. So we have a notation engine built into Aural Musition. This is not Sibelius or Finale. But it is quite powerful, and for creating certain question types, it can be a really quick and easy way to create content. If you do have existing content in Sibelius or Finale or another notation program, you can export that as music XML and then import it in as well. We don't support everything that those programs do, but it can be a way of getting existing content into the programs really easily. So I've got my blank score here at the moment. I'm just going to jump into the settings here and just add my extra parts. So I'm just going to hide the display name first of all, and I'm going to add an additional part, which will be my base part. And while I'm in here, I'm just going to set my stem directions to up and down for voice 1 and voice 2. And I will do that for my first part as well. Up and down, and I'm just going to brace these two parts together. I'm also going to select my meter. I'll just set this up as 2/4 for now. And I'm going to set my key as D major. And we'll start with a 4-bar example. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to enter my chord symbols. And I come up here to select my editing mode. I go to chord symbols, figured. And I can come and just easily punch these in. So I'm going to enter following progression. Now, while I'm here, I am going to add some notation as well. And I'm just going to use this particular mode for notation entry here. So I can only enter a single note in each voice for the moment. And the reason I'm going to do this is just to illustrate how you can use existing notation then so that you can create some of those different question formats, whether you're going to supply the soprano line, perhaps provide the first chord of the question, and so on. So let me just pop a few things in here for that. So I'm just going to enter an entire first chord, a soprano part, and perhaps a bass part. So again, I've just switched over to voice 2 there so that I can enter my alto and bass parts. So let me scale this from now. Okay, so I've got some bass notation there that I can use to help generate some different question types. Now, let me see. So what we need to do is save this notation to our library. And this is really easily done under this little 3-line hamburger menu here. I'm going to save it directly to the library. And give it a name. And really importantly, under the tags area here, I'm just going to add a tag here so that I can easily find this at a later stage, whether it be in the library or when I'm creating a test or worksheet. Okay, so that is saved. So now when I jump across to my library, I can find this question. I can search for Music 101. Sorry, I can find this notation really easily. And there it is there. Another thing you should be aware of in regard to searching the library is there are literally hundreds of questions already, not only just 4-part writing questions, but hundreds of questions already in the library that you can use. So there may already be lots of super common progressions that are already available in there. So again, you don't necessarily need to start from scratch. You can come and use any of these notation files, and most of these already have existing questions. So for anyone who hasn't explored the library before, essentially all the media is kind of listed down the left-hand side here. Any attached questions are over on the right here. And the library can include real audio recordings, notation files, images, and a range of different things. Anyway, I digress. Let me jump back to our focus here. So we've got our progression that we've added. now we're going to create a question. So over here on the right, I'm just going to click on the plus button. And I'm just going to give it a quick name here, which is not exposed. It's just for a general labeling in the library. And that text, of course, can be whatever you would like it to be. Again, I'm just going to add a tag in here, Muse 101, so I can easily find this question later. Now we are going to create a notation-based question. So you can see that selected up the top there, and then under the question drop down here, I can select 4-part writing. Okay, and then I have to simply select the notation that I'm going to use here, click select. It's right at the top of our list at the moment, but again, this is where the search term can come in handy if you're trying to search amongst the huge library there. So here's my notation. So to begin with, I'm going to create a question which simply provides the students with blank notation just with the Roman numerals and figures provided there. So over on the left here, you'll see some icons that indicate whether the notation is displayed and also whether each voice is editable. So I want my students to be able to edit each voice. So I'm just going to enable all of those. Now the next step is I actually want to hide this notation. So by clicking on the notation itself, I can actually highlight all those notes, and I can, in doing that, I am hiding them for when the question is delivered to the student. So that question is kind of set up how I want it. I have a few other options up here. So any of these items at the moment will currently be replaced with rests, but I'd like to replace each of these note values with just a blank bar. I'm also going to limit my students to only be able to add single notes in each voice. And the stem direction has already been set up in my notation file, so I can just leave that as no change there. You can override various stem direction options there. Okay, so that question looks pretty well set up to me. We'll have a look at some other options in a minute, but as the instructor, you can easily preview this question just by clicking on that preview button up there. And this is what our question looks like. The student can easily enter their answer, check their answer, and so on. Now, just while we're here creating custom questions, I'll just demonstrate how to create some variants on that particular question type if you choose to use them. Again, once you create a question, it's really easy to create a copy of that question. And then I can just double click on that to open it. Now, as I illustrated before, I'd like to create a different question type here where I actually provide the entire first chord here. So the student has a starting point voicing to begin with. So I can really easily just click on that first bar to make that happen. And then all of a sudden, the question looks like this. And a couple of other variations. Again, I'll just do a quick copy of my copy. I can, of course, rename that question to be whatever I like. And this time around, I actually just want to provide the student with the soprano part. So I'm actually going to make that not editable. But I do want to hide the alto in the first bar and also the entire first bar in the tenor and bass parts. So all of a sudden, I've got a different question format that I can use here. Okay, soprano given, the student can then complete the other voices. One other quick option that I should illustrate here is if you want to limit the note palette so the student can only enter complete note values, rhythmic values for the bar. Under options here, you can simply turn off anything that may not be relevant at this particular level. So I can enable purely just having the half notes there and turn off any rests. And the other option there is to provide a play answer button, so the student can play back their answer as part of the question. So now you'll note that we only have one rhythmic value available to us, and we also, once we enter our answer, we also have a play my answer button there available to us. Okay, the final question type that I'll illustrate before we jump into some of the finer rule selections is one that I demonstrated earlier. In this case, we actually want to provide both the soprano and the bass part. So I can achieve this by simply turning off editing on the bass part. And that's what this question looks like. So again, a key takeaway here is working with any custom content in the library, in either Musition or Auralia, you can mix and match the content to create lots of different question types from one piece of media. Now that this particular item is in the library, I could use it for other types of dictation questions in Auralia. It could be a monophonic dictation question, it could be a two-part. And if I had completed all the voices, then it could have been a harmonic dictation question. So really flexible in the way that you can use content across both programs and across lots of different question types. So even if you're feeling as though you're spending time creating media to bring into the library, you can really easily use it in lots and lots of different ways. So you get really good value out of creating your own content in that way. Okay, so what we might do now is we've explored most of these things. We're getting a bit tight on time, so we won't look at integrating these questions into your levels or worksheets in detail today. We have other training videos that cover those features in detail. Suffice to say that if you're creating your own custom syllabus or a formal assessment or just a supporting worksheet, you can add any of these questions really easily into those levels or into those kind of test or assessment entries, so your students can access them. Now, before we move on to the rule sets and the scoring scheme, I'd like to just speak really briefly about how the scoring works. So this will kind of clarify. This will make more sense once we start looking at some of the scoring rules and options here. So if we come back to, actually this third question is probably a good example. Essentially for the scoring, the way the system deals with the scoring is that it's essentially assigning a number of marks for the chord spelling or the chord realization for each chord, and then a separate score for the voice leading, excuse me, between chords in and out of each chord. So in a question like this, where basically I provided the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bars of notation, the student is only getting assessed on what they've entered in these last 2 bars, plus the voice leading between the third last bar and the second last bar. So in this case, you can see that the scoring is out of 12. So they've been, in this particular case, there have been 2 marks awarded for each of these chords, and then 4 marks for the voice leading in and out of those chords. So a total of 8 for the voice leading either side, and then play, and then the chord spelling 2 marks for each of those. So what that means is, as we jump into customizing our rule sets, we can see how we can control these elements. I will say just quickly, the scoring and the rule sets can be set per syllabus and also overridden on a test basis, on a per test basis, if you like. So I'll just show you where you can access those options, because in some cases they're tucked away a little bit. Hopefully you'll never need to touch them, so that won't be an issue for you, but if you do, I'd just like to make sure you know where they are. So when you're assigning them per syllabus, you can select your syllabus here on the left, And then again, under the cog here, you can come into drill options. And then right down the bottom here, we can see our part writing rule set. There are some options already set up in there that you can choose from: AP Music Theory, our default rule set, as well as some that align with some textbooks. So you can easily choose that and assign that rule set to your syllabus quite quickly and easily there. Something else to note really quickly is that here you can also allow or set the number of checks that are allowed when students are practicing in that syllabus. So by default, that is set to 10. So you can define this for each syllabus as you go. Now, to override this on a test, I'll just jump into the test area here. We access these settings in a slightly different way. So they are done over here on the test settings. Again, the little cog icon. And you can see these settings down here. So by default, this will actually be set to 0, assuming that people will largely want to use tests or worksheets for assessment kinds of purposes. So this setting by default will be set at 0. But of course, you can override that. And for my demonstration worksheet today, I set that at 20. So this just allows you to essentially create a worksheet that has a really defined set of questions in it that you can still allow students to use as a learning task. So they can still get that feedback. They can check their answer up to 20 times before they actually have to submit their final answer. Okay, so now as far as the nitty-gritty of the more fine-grained control of these options, I'm going to jump into manage here. So I've just gone back to syllabus and I've clicked on the cog here to go into my syllabus drill options, and I'll go down to manage down the bottom here. Okay, so again, you can see up the top here, we have our presets that you saw before. We can use any of those. These are all locked, but you can really easily either create your own new rule set or copy one of the existing ones and edit it to suit your needs. So I'm just going to make a quick copy of the default one. And again, I'll use my Muse 101 preset name here to give that a label. So what this means now is that I can create a custom rule and marking schemes for my particular preset here. So first of all, let's have a look at the marking. As I mentioned before, this essentially allows you to assign a specific maximum number of marks per chord, and then also maximum number of marks in and out of each chord. So this top column here is probably going to be one of the more common usage scenarios where the student is given all the Roman numerals with no notation provided on the score, and they have to enter all the parts. So in this case, the default settings again are two marks for each chord and 4 marks in and out of each chord for the voice leading. If you do decide to create other question types where perhaps the soprano is given, so that would align with this second column here. So 1 note is given for each chord here. And in this case, the defaults are a little bit less weighted towards the assessment of the voice leading. Given that the soprano line has been provided, there are some implications to the voice leading options that are available for the student. And then as we move down further, this final column here would apply to a situation perhaps where you provided, say, the bass, tenor and alto notation all on the staff, and you purely wanted the student to enter the soprano. It's probably not a very common usage case, but it is available there for you. And finally, this option here relates largely to a function that is very useful to like an AP music theory scoring type scheme. And this basically means that if the student gets any chord spelling, or makes any chord spelling or chord realization error, they automatically lose their voice leading marks in and out of that chord. I think it's referred to as the triangle of death or something quite ominous. But yes, so that can be enabled there. You can also set thresholds for it. So by default, again, it's set up so that if the student makes any errors in their voice, in their chord spelling or realization, this option will kick in. But you can set it to a higher number so that it only applies once the student makes perhaps 2 errors when they're spelling out a chord. All right, I'm going to leave that off for now. Okay, as we get further down the list here, this is where we have even more fine-grained control over each of the rules. So firstly, you can see all the chord spelling and the voice leading rules are kind of listed here. And these columns give us special control over how these rules are applied. The enabled column obviously turns some of these elements just on and off, so they won't actually be included in the assessment of a question at all. In other cases, you can choose to have something perhaps enabled, so it will be reported to the student if they make a particular error, but perhaps depending on where you are in the delivery of your curriculum, you may not want students to actually be penalised for it. So in this case, hidden fifths, hidden octaves, we're having this rule is enabled, it will be reported upon, but it will not weigh in on the assessment. And of course, the final column here, you can determine how harsh or lenient you would like to be with each of these, errors. So parallel fifths, if you decide that that's a little bit unfair, you can of course turn that assessment, that deduction down to suit your needs. So lots of kind of flexibility, there. Now, once we start to look at the rules themselves, there are then, for some of the rules, there are many options. Actually, just before I move on to that, I will say, even just being able to control some of these elements from here, even without playing with the deductions, does enable you to provide different marking schemes, again, depending on where your students are at in their 4-part learning journey. So, I'm sure you all have different sequences that you like to introduce different rules and things. And so for a student to get penalised with something that's more advanced whilst they're dealing with really basic kind of tendency tone resolution may seem a bit unreasonable. So these checkboxes, these options, allow you to create separate presets that you might choose to assign to a test or a syllabus that are perhaps much earlier on in the student's learning cycle. So, okay, as I mentioned, for some of these rules, there are lots and lots of different options over on the right here that you can have access to really have fine-grained control over exactly the types of resolutions, doubling, omission that you would like to apply. I'm not going to spend time on all of these now. They are vast and giving you lots of control if you want it. There may be things like unequal fifths, allowances to let them occur in specific progressions, and where perhaps the voices are moving in parallel tense and outer voices, and so on. So Musition will cater for and allow all sorts of variations in these types of questions, and in these types of rule applications. Okay, finally, up here in the feedback, this determines what's displayed in the text feedback in the interface for your students. So before, when we were in here, whoops, let me go to something that I've actually answered. In here, you can control what information is actually displayed here. If you deem the student is getting too much information here, pointing to really specific info, then you can actually hide some of that info so that they perhaps have to figure some aspects of it out themselves. So we've covered most of these aspects now. I really hope that's given you a kind of clear understanding of the power of this new feature, the flexibility of it, but also giving you an idea of how much hopefully really useful content is already available there for you. So you don't necessarily have to choose to explore all of these advanced options. You can simply use the content as it stands, or just reshuffle it to meet your sequence, the sequence of content in your particular course. Let me just check really quickly if there's any Q&A. Quick question here, which it looks as though they've kind of been answered. So this feature, Musition and Aural I, we're hoping they'll be out within the next couple of weeks. And I think I've covered here the option here for assigning different weighting for different rules and things. So you can obviously get into all of those fun little options there. If you have any other questions along the way, please pop them in the Q&A. I'll hang around a bit after the webinar is officially over. I will release another poll now. If you're not currently using the programs and you would love to have a closer look at them, you can we can set you up with a cloud trial so that you can have a closer look at the programs. For anyone who's already using them, we'll be in touch as soon as version 7 is ready, so that we can then just simply, if you're using the cloud edition, we'll simply upgrade your service and you will have access to all those features and content. The cloud trial does give you the option to, of course, use the programs with your students as well. Not again, but just so you know, we do have some other upcoming webinars, one next week at the same time, covering our new site singing feature or recording feature in Auralia. I've got a little screenshot here of what that looks like for you. So this just means that you can use lots of singing exercises, improvisation exercises, singing with accompaniment, whether it be audio or notation. You can deliver all these types of questions within Auralia. So it just gives you a lot of control rather than having to have students submit things on YouTube from their phones and so on. Also in mid-November, we have another one that will be exploring a bunch of the new content in the programs. We'll be looking at some of the 4-part content again, but it will be largely focused on exploring new questions we have based around works by composers of colour, women composers, as well as looking at ways you can integrate pop, jazz, world music sources in your Aural and Musition content. And that means you can draw from YouTube clips, any kind of external sources. It could be scores that are hosted online within your LMS, or even just a random training video, tutorial video that someone's posted on some obscure website. So you can include URL links within your questions and things like that. So lots of great ways to integrate new content there. And of course, finally, a bunch of resources here. We always love to hear from people, get feedback about things you like, things you dislike, suggestions, whether they be for workflow content, any kinds of requests. We love to hear about all those sorts of things. We do have a weekly Zoom support, and I will quickly just pop those links in the chat for you, so you can get to those. So those links are in the chat there for you now if you have interest in any of those items or need support. As I said, our weekly Zoom support is hosted by colleague Tim Solly. Great chance to just have a chat, even if you have further questions about some of the things we discussed today. Feel free to drop in and explore any of that. Finally, Facebook group. That is an interesting, fun resource where, you know, educators are sharing kind of real world problems they are having in trying to deliver their curriculum, and sharing kind of best practice for using the programs in the real world. And finally, our YouTube channel can be useful for training videos and things of that nature. So we'll be uploading this webinar there at some point and then sharing that with everyone. Well, that's about it from me. I do really appreciate you taking time out of your busy lives to join us for this. As I said, please get in touch if you have any other questions along the way. I will hang around in the Q&A for a little bit and leave that open. So feel free to drop any other questions in there. And hopefully this has been of use and interest to you, and hopefully it will help you and you save a bunch of time and help your students kind of maximize their learning potential in this kind of very challenging learning area in the magical world of music theory pedagogy. So thanks very much for joining us. Take care, and we'll hopefully chat to you soon. Cheers.